Imagine this, you're a colonial settler in 1692 Salem, Massachusetts, and your neighbor has just accused you of practicing witchcraft. Within hours, you find yourself bound to a wooden post in the town square, facing a punishment so brutal that death might seem merciful. Colonial America operated under a harsh system of justice, where public humiliation and physical torment were considered essential tools for maintaining order and moral righteousness. The punishments inflicted upon colonists, ranging from petty criminals to accused witches, reflected a society struggling to impose European legal traditions upon a dangerous and unfamiliar frontier, from public humiliation devices that left victims at the mercy of vengeful crowds to slow crushing deaths that could last for days. These are the most horrifying punishment methods of colonial America, starting with pillory. The pillory stood as one of colonial America's most widespread instruments of public humiliation. This wooden framework featured holes precisely carved to trap a victim's head and hands, rendering them completely defenseless against whatever torments awaited. Unlike modern prisons that hide criminals from public view, colonial justice demanded spectacle. Town squares across New England and the mid-Atlantic colonies featured these devices prominently, ensuring maximum visibility for the community's moral lessons. The pillory transformed punishment into entertainment. Colonial authorities deliberately scheduled these public displays during market days, when crowds would naturally gather. Citizens viewed attendance as both civic duty and welcomed diversion from their harsh frontier existence. The device's construction forced victims into an agonizing bent position, with their neck and wrists locked in place for hours at a time. Thomas Morton discovered the pillory's brutal reality firsthand in Boston during 1634. This English lawyer had established a settlement at Mount Wollaston, south of the Puritan stronghold, where he traded firearms to local Native American tribes. The Massachusetts Bay Colony considered such commerce tantamount to treason, as it potentially armed their enemies. Colonial authorities seized Morton and dragged him to Boston's town square, where a crowd had already assembled around the wooden framework. Morton's head and hands disappeared into the device's unforgiving holes as the wooden beam crashed down and locked into place. The position forced him to bend at an unnatural angle. His spine curved painfully as his trapped limbs bore his body's weight. Hours stretched endlessly as curious colonists gathered to witness his humiliation. Children pointed and laughed while their parents delivered stern lectures about the consequences of defying colonial law. The pillory's true horror emerged through crowd participation. Spectators arrived armed with rotten vegetables, spoiled eggs, and animal excrement collected specifically for the occasion. Morton's defenseless position made him an irresistible target as projectiles rained down upon his exposed face and body. The stench became overwhelming as decomposing matter splattered across his hair and clothing, mixing with his own sweat and blood from where the wooden restraints chafed his skin. Weather provided no mercy for pilloried victims. Summer heat intensified the smell of rotting food while drawing swarms of flies to feast on the accumulated filth. Winter cold numbed exposed flesh as victims shivered helplessly in their restraints. Rain soaked through clothing and mixed the various substances coating their bodies into a putrid soup that dripped steadily onto the ground below. Samuel Sewall, a prominent Boston judge, documented numerous pillory sentences throughout the late 1600s in his detailed diary. His entries reveal the frequency with which colonial authorities employed this punishment for crimes ranging from theft to adultery to blasphemy. Sewall's accounts describe victims who emerged from the pillory permanently marked by their experience, their reputations destroyed, and their social standing obliterated. The physical toll often proved severe. Victims frequently collapsed when finally released, their legs unable to support them after hours in the bent position. Some suffered permanent nerve damage in their hands and arms from the sustained pressure of the wooden restraints. Others developed infections from the various substances hurled at them, particularly when sharp objects opened wounds in their exposed skin. Colonial authorities viewed such suffering as divinely ordained justice. Puritan theology taught that public shame would purify both the criminal and the community that witnessed their punishment. The pillory served multiple purposes beyond mere punishment, functioning as moral theatre where colonists could reinforce their shared values while enjoying the spectacle of another's downfall. The device's psychological impact often exceeded its physical torment. Victims faced complete helplessness as their neighbours, people they had known for years, gathered to mock and abuse them. Former friends became tormentors, children they had watched grow up pelted them with refuse, and respected community members delivered righteous lectures about their moral failures. This social destruction frequently proved more devastating than any physical pain the pillory could inflict. Morton eventually secured his release and returned to England, but countless other colonists endured similar ordeals throughout the 1600s and early 1700s. The pillory remained a fixture of colonial justice until gradually falling from favour as American attitudes toward punishment evolved. However, during its peak usage, this simple wooden framework represented the colonists' determination to maintain order and moral authority in their precarious New World settlements, regardless of the human cost such justice demanded. Ducking. Colonial authorities reserved ducking as their preferred method for silencing women who dared speak too boldly. This punishment involved strapping victims to a specialised chair called a cucking stool, then repeatedly plunging them into rivers, ponds, or wells until they either confessed their sins or lost consciousness. The Puritans who dominated much of colonial society believed that water possessed divine properties that would reject evil spirits, making drowning an ideal test of moral purity. The cucking stool resembled a crude wooden chair, mounted on a long pole that functioned like a massive seesaw. Operators positioned this contraption near bodies of water, with the chair extending out over the deepest sections. A pulley system allowed multiple men to control the victim's descent and ascent, regulating both the speed and duration of each submersion. The device's mechanical precision transformed drowning from accidental death into calculated torture. Colonial communities targeted women they labelled as scolds, a term describing females who gossiped excessively, argued with their husbands, or challenged male authority in any form. These communities viewed such behaviour as dangerous threats to their carefully structured social order. Women who spoke their minds disrupted the peaceful submission that colonial leaders demanded from their female population. Goodwife Mendam learned this lesson brutally in Plymouth Colony during 1672. Her neighbours had grown increasingly irritated by her sharp tongue and tendency to spread unflattering stories about prominent families. The final straw came when she publicly criticised the local minister's sermon, declaring his interpretation of scripture ignorant and misguided. Such boldness from a woman scandalised the community and demanded immediate correction. Colonial authorities dragged Mendam from her home on a crisp autumn morning as curious neighbours gathered along the riverbank. The cucking stool waited at the water's edge, its wooden chair worn smooth by previous victims. Rough hands forced Mendam into the seat and secured leather straps around her wrists, waist and ankles. The restraints ensured she could neither escape nor protect herself during the ordeal ahead. The first plunge came without warning. The chair dropped rapidly toward the dark water as Mendam screamed in terror, her voice cutting across the morning air before disappearing beneath the surface with a violent splash. Cold river water flooded her mouth and nose, choking off her cries as she fought desperately against the leather bonds. Panic consumed her thoughts as water filled her lungs and darkness pressed against her vision. Just as unconsciousness threatened to claim her, strong arms hauled the chair back to the surface. Mendam emerged gasping and choking, river water streaming from her hair and clothing as she gulped frantically for air. Her chest burned with each ragged breath, while her soaked garments clung heavily to her shivering body. The crowd watched expectantly, waiting for her confession, and promised to reform her contentious ways. When Mendam remained defiant, cursing her tormentors between desperate gasps for breath, the chair plunged downward again. This second submersion lasted longer than the first, testing the precise boundary between punishment and execution. The operators had perfected their technique through countless previous duckings, learning exactly how long a human could survive underwater before permanent damage occurred. Each successive plunge weakened Mendam's resistance as her body grew numb from cold and exhaustion. River water had soaked completely through her clothing, adding tremendous weight that made each breath more laborious. Her hair hung in sodden strands across her face, while her lips turned blue from the frigid temperature. Still, the crowd demanded her acknowledgement of wrongdoing and sworn promise to hold her tongue in the future. The psychological torture often proved as devastating as the physical ordeal. Victims experienced complete helplessness as they descended toward the water, knowing death waited just moments away if their tormentors chose to leave them submerged too long. The repeated cycle of drowning and rescue created overwhelming terror that broke even the strongest wills. Puritan theology provided convenient justification for this brutality. Ministers taught that innocent souls would be rejected by the water and float safely, while guilty spirits would sink toward their rightful punishment. This divine test supposedly revealed God's judgment on the victim's moral character, transforming torture into religious ceremony. Many victims emerged from ducking permanently changed by their experience. The repeated near drowning often left lasting damage to their lungs and nervous systems. More significantly, the public humiliation destroyed their social standing within tightly knit colonial communities. Former friends shunned them, while neighbours whispered about their moral failings whenever they appeared in public. Mendam eventually broke under the relentless assault, tearfully confessing her sins and begging forgiveness from the assembled crowd. Her ordeal ended only when she swore never again to challenge male authority or spread gossip through the community. She returned home a broken woman, her spirit crushed as thoroughly as her reputation, serving as a permanent warning to other females who might consider defying colonial expectations of feminine submission. Branding. Colonial authorities employed branding as their most permanent form of punishment, using red-hot iron letters to burn identifying marks into criminals' flesh. These brands served as lifetime advertisements of moral failure, ensuring that no criminal could escape their past or blend anonymously into new communities. The most common marks included T for thieves, A for adulterers, and B for blasphemers, though colonial creativity produced dozens of variations for specific crimes. The branding process required careful preparation to maximize both physical agony and public spectacle. Blacksmiths heated iron letters in roaring forges until they glowed bright orange, hot enough to sear through skin and into the muscle beneath. Colonial authorities scheduled these ceremonies during peak community gathering times, transforming punishment into moral theatre that reinforced shared values through witnessed suffering. Christopher Holder experienced this brutality firsthand in Massachusetts Bay Colony during 1656. This English Quaker had arrived in Boston as part of a small group spreading their religious beliefs throughout Puritan territory. The Quakers preached dangerous ideas about direct communication with God, bypassing the established clergy that colonial leaders considered essential for maintaining social order. Such heretical teachings threatened the very foundation of Puritan society. Colonial authorities arrested Holder after he disrupted a Sunday service by standing and declaring that the minister spoke falsehoods about divine revelation. His bold interruption scandalized the congregation and demanded immediate correction. The magistrates sentenced him to receive the brand of heresy, marking him permanently as an enemy of true faith. The ceremony began at dawn in Boston's Central Square as curious colonists gathered around a wooden platform constructed specifically for public punishments. Guards dragged Holder from his cell and forced him onto the stage, where a blacksmith tended a portable forge that glowed like a miniature version of hell itself. The iron letter H rested among the coals, its metal surface radiating heat that distorted the air around it. 4 strong men seized Holder's arms and forced him face down onto a wooden table, while a 5th pinned his head in position. The chosen location for his brand was his forehead, ensuring that every person he encountered for the rest of his life would immediately recognize him as a condemned heretic. No hat or hood could completely conceal the mark that would soon scar his flesh. The blacksmith lifted the glowing iron with long tongs, carefully examining its color to ensure optimal temperature for maximum tissue damage. Too cool, and the brand would heal poorly, creating an unclear mark that defeated the punishment's purpose. Too hot and the iron might kill the victim outright, denying them their lifetime of marked shame. Experience had taught colonial craftsmen the precise heat needed for perfect scarring. Holder's screams pierced the morning air as the red-hot metal pressed against his forehead with a violent hiss. The smell of burning flesh filled the square, while smoke rose from the contact point between iron and skin. The brand burned through multiple layers of tissue in seconds, destroying nerves and blood vessels, while cooking the surrounding area into permanent disfigurement. The iron held its position for exactly 10 seconds, long enough to create a deep, unmistakable mark that would never fade. When the blacksmith finally lifted the tool, it left behind a perfect letter, H, burned into Holder's forehead, the edges charred black, while the center revealed raw, weeping flesh beneath. Blood mixed with other bodily fluids as Holder's body went into shock from the tremendous trauma. Medical treatment remained deliberately minimal to ensure proper scarring formation. Colonial authorities wanted clear, permanent marks that would identify branded criminals from considerable distances. They provided just enough care to prevent fatal infection, while allowing the wounds to heal into raised, discoloured tissue that stood out dramatically against normal skin. The social consequences often proved more devastating than the physical agony. Branded individuals found themselves permanently excluded from respectable society, unable to conduct normal business or form new relationships without immediately explaining their criminal past. Children fled from their approach, while adults crossed streets to avoid contact with marked sinners. Repeat offenders faced progressive branding on different body parts as their crimes accumulated. Thieves who returned to stealing, after receiving their initial T, might find additional letters burned into their cheeks, hands, or arms. Some career criminals accumulated multiple brands that told the complete story of their moral degradation across their scarred flesh. Holder survived his ordeal and eventually escaped Massachusetts, but the brand followed him everywhere he travelled. Even sympathetic Quaker communities could not erase the permanent reminder of his clash with colonial authority. His scarred forehead served as a constant advertisement for Puritan justice, warning others about the consequences of challenging established religious order. The psychological impact extended beyond the branded victims to their families and communities. Parents pointed to marked criminals as examples of moral failure, while children learned early lessons about obedience and conformity. The brands transformed human beings into living billboards for colonial values, ensuring that punishment continued long after the initial ceremony ended. Whipping, the cat-o'-nine-tails dominated colonial punishment as the most feared instrument of physical correction. This specialised whip featured 9 separate leather strands, each designed to tear flesh in different directions with every strike. Unlike simple whips that created single wounds, the cat-o'-nine-tails produced multiple lacerations simultaneously, maximising both pain and tissue damage. Colonial authorities positioned whipping posts prominently in town centres, making attendance at these brutal spectacles a civic obligation for all community members. The whipping post itself stood as a permanent reminder of colonial justice, its weathered wood stained dark from countless previous victims. Iron rings mounted at various heights allowed punishment to be tailored to victims of different sizes, ensuring optimal positioning for maximum effectiveness. The surrounding area remained permanently clear of buildings or obstacles that might obstruct public viewing of the proceedings. Hugh Davis discovered the whip's devastating power in Virginia colony during 1640. This young, indentured servant had formed an intimate relationship with an enslaved African woman, violating one of colonial society's most fundamental taboos. Interracial relationships threatened the carefully constructed racial hierarchy that colonial leaders considered essential for maintaining control over their diverse population. Such transgression demanded severe correction to prevent similar violations from spreading. Colonial authorities seized Davis from his master's plantation on a humid summer morning as word of his sentence spread through the surrounding community. Curious spectators began gathering around the whipping post before dawn, eager to witness the punishment that would reinforce their shared understanding of acceptable behaviour. The crowd included men, women, and children from across the social spectrum, all united in their anticipation of witnessing justice. The executioner arrived carrying the cat-o'-nine-tails with ceremonial reverence, displaying the weapon for the assembled crowd to examine and fear. Each leather strand measured precisely 3 feet in length, crafted from specially treated cowhide that would neither break nor stretch under repeated use. Metal fragments embedded in the leather tips ensured maximum tissue damage with every strike. Guards dragged Davis to the whipping post and began the ritualized preparation that preceded every public flogging. They stripped him to the waist, exposing the broad expanse of his back to the crowd's scrutiny. His pale skin contrasted sharply with the dark wood of the post as leather restraints secured his wrists to the iron rings above his head. The position stretched his back taut, creating an ideal canvas for the punishment ahead. The executioner raised the cat-o'-nine-tails high above his head, pausing dramatically to allow tension to build among the spectators. The crowd fell silent except for the whispered counting that would track each stroke toward the prescribed total of 40 lashes. This number represented divine justice, as biblical precedent established 40 as the maximum punishment a human body could endure without permanent crippling. The first strike landed with explosive force across Davis's shoulder blades. 9 separate strands bit into his flesh simultaneously, each finding slightly different angles of attack that maximized the wound pattern. His screams echoed across the town square as blood began flowing from multiple parallel cuts that decorated his back in precise geometric patterns. The crowd responded with satisfied murmurs, their voices mixing approval with fascination as they witnessed the whip's devastating effectiveness. Children pressed closer to better observe the punishment, while their parents provided running commentary about the necessity of maintaining proper social boundaries. Each subsequent lash drew fresh cries from Davis and renewed attention from the assembled spectators. By the 10th stroke, Davis's back had transformed into a canvas of torn flesh and flowing blood. The cat-o'-nine-tails had opened dozens of separate wounds that crossed and recrossed each other, creating a complex web of destruction across his entire upper torso. His initial screams had given way to hoarse gasping as shock began overwhelming his nervous system. The executioner maintained perfect rhythm throughout the punishment, spacing each stroke to allow maximum impact while preventing Davis from losing consciousness prematurely. Professional pride demanded that victims remain awake for their complete sentence, experiencing every moment of their correction. Skilled executioners could calibrate their strikes to keep victims conscious through even the most severe punishments. Spectators continued their methodical counting as the lash total climbed toward its biblical maximum. 20, 25, 30 strokes transformed Davis's back into raw meat that barely resembled human tissue. Blood spattered the whipping post, the surrounding ground, and even reached spectators standing in the front rows of the crowd. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the physical trauma. Davis faced complete helplessness as his community gathered to celebrate his destruction, their voices raised in approval with each stroke that tore his flesh. Former acquaintances watched his punishment with satisfaction, while strangers used his suffering as entertainment and moral instruction for their children. When the 40th and final stroke landed, Davis hung unconscious from his restraints, his back a ruined landscape of torn flesh and exposed muscle. Medical attention remained deliberately minimal to ensure proper scar formation that would serve as a permanent reminder of his transgression. The scars would mark him for life as a man who had violated colonial society's most sacred boundaries, ensuring his punishment continued long after his wounds healed. Pressing. Peine forte dure represented colonial America's most horrifying execution method, reserved for those who refused to enter formal pleas in court. This French term, meaning hard and forceful punishment, described a process where victims were slowly crushed to death under increasing weight over several days. The procedure served a specific purpose beyond mere execution, as defendants who died without entering pleas could preserve their property for their families, preventing colonial authorities from seizing their estates as punishment for crimes. The pressing procedure required careful preparation to maximize both suffering and public spectacle. Executioners laid victims flat on the ground, then placed a heavy wooden board across their chest. Stone weights were added gradually over multiple days, allowing the crowd to witness the slow progression from discomfort to agony to death. This methodical approach transformed execution into extended torture that could last up to a week. Giles Corey endured this ultimate punishment in Salem, Massachusetts during 1692, when the infamous witch trials consumed the community with supernatural terror. This 80-year-old farmer faced accusations of practicing witchcraft alongside his wife Martha, charges that could result in death and complete property forfeiture. Colonial authorities demanded that Corey enter a formal plea of guilty or innocent, but the cunning old man recognized the trap hidden within their legal maneuvering. Corey understood that any plea would lead to a trial he could never win. The Salem witch trials had already demonstrated their predetermined outcomes, with accusation serving as conviction and denial proving guilt through its very existence. A guilty plea meant immediate execution and property seizure, while an innocent plea would trigger a trial ending in the same result. His refusal to plea represented the only strategy that might preserve something for his family. Colonial authorities dragged Corey to an open field beside Salem's courthouse on a grey September morning. Curious spectators gathered despite the early hour, drawn by morbid fascination with this rare and terrible punishment. The executioners had prepared their materials carefully, selecting smooth river stones of varying sizes that could be added progressively to create the desired crushing effect. They forced Corey onto his back in a shallow depression that had been dug specifically for the procedure. His aged body appeared frail against the hard-packed earth as guards secured his arms and legs with heavy rope. The wooden board came next, a thick oak plank that covered his entire torso from shoulders to waist. Its weight alone made breathing laborious for the elderly man. The first stones landed with dull thuds that echoed across the field. Each addition increased the pressure on Corey's chest, forcing air from his lungs and making each breath a conscious struggle. The crowd watched in fascination as his face began changing colour, shifting from pale to red as his circulatory system fought against the mounting compression. Magistrates approached repeatedly during the first day, offering Corey chances to enter his plea and end his suffering. They explained how quickly his ordeal could conclude if he would simply speak the required words. Instead, Corey gasped out his famous response that would echo through American history: "More weight." His defiant words shocked the assembled crowd and infuriated the authorities, who expected swift submission. The second day brought additional stones as Corey's condition deteriorated visibly. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, while his lips turned blue from lack of oxygen. The massive weight pressing down on his chest had begun fracturing his ribs, creating internal injuries that caused him to cough up blood. Still, he refused to speak the words that would end his torment and begin his trial. Spectators marvelled at the old man's incredible endurance as the crushing continued into the third day. More stones joined the growing pile, while Corey's body slowly succumbed to the relentless pressure. His ribcage had collapsed partially, puncturing his lungs and filling his chest cavity with fluid. Each breath became a monumental effort that required tremendous willpower to complete. Throughout the ordeal, Corey maintained his stubborn silence regarding his plea, while occasionally requesting more weight when magistrates approached with offers of mercy. His defiance transformed him from accused witch into folk hero, demonstrating courage that impressed even his executioners. The crowd's initial enthusiasm for witnessing his punishment gradually shifted to grudging admiration for his remarkable fortitude. On the third afternoon, additional stones finally broke Corey's resistance, along with his remaining ribs. His chest could no longer expand sufficiently to draw breath, and his heart struggled against the enormous pressure compressing his entire torso. Blood frothed from his mouth as internal bleeding accelerated, signalling that death approached rapidly. Corey's final moments came as the sun set over Salem, his life ending without ever entering the plea that authorities had demanded. His death served its intended purpose, preserving his property for his surviving family members while denying colonial officials the satisfaction of a formal conviction. The stones that had slowly crushed his body became instruments of his ultimate victory over a corrupt system. The pressing had lasted exactly 72 hours, making Corey's execution one of the most prolonged and public deaths in colonial American history. His defiant final words became legend, while his strategic use of an archaic punishment created lasting precedent that would influence American jurisprudence for generations.